Emily Wells stared at the check in her trembling hands. Not $300, not $3,000, but $75,000. Her breath caught in her throat as her fingers tightened around the paper, as if letting go would make it evaporate into the crisp autumn air. Across, from her, Meryl Streep stood calmly, her sophisticated presence somehow both commanding and gentle. The actress's eyes, those famous, expressive eyes that had captivated audiences for decades, remained steady, unwavering in their sincerity. "This isn't charity," Meryl said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had delivered countless unforgettable lines on screen. "It's recognition of extraordinary talent." Emily swallowed hard. The world around her seemed to blur at the edges, the busy New York sidewalk fading into background noise. 20 minutes ago, she had been just another struggling artist on the street, an anonymous young woman selling paintings to indifferent passers-by. Now she stood at the center of something she couldn't yet comprehend. But how had she gotten here? The first person to notice wasn't Emily at all. It was a college student, backpack slung over one shoulder, who did a double take as he passed her modest art display. His eyes widened, darting between the elegant woman examining a portrait and his phone screen, where he quickly pulled up a photo for comparison. "Oh my God," he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That's Meryl Streep." The name rippled through the crowd like electricity. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, discreetly at first, then more boldly as the realization spread. Emily, focused on carefully wrapping a small watercolor for another customer, hadn't immediately processed what was happening. The shift in energy around her stand registered before the actual cause. A strange electricity in the air, a collective intake of breath. When she finally looked up, Emily found herself staring directly into the face she'd seen countless times, on screen but never expected to encounter on this unremarkable street corner. Meryl Streep, 3-time Academy Award winner, was studying one of her portraits with undisguised interest. "Did you paint this?" Meryl asked, her fingers hovering near the canvas without touching it. The portrait showed an elderly woman, her face mapped with wrinkles, each line telling its own story. Despite the subject's age, Emily had captured an unmistakable fire in her eyes, a resilience that transcended the physical form. "I did," Emily managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She fought the urge to smooth her faded beanie or adjust the colorful scarf that concealed her hair loss. "Just last week." Meryl nodded, something flickering across her expression, recognition perhaps of the technical skill or the emotional truth captured in brushstrokes. "It's extraordinary, the way you've captured her essence." She paused, studying Emily now, with the same intensity she'd given the painting. "There's something rare here, something honest." A small crowd had begun to form, maintaining a respectful distance but unmistakably drawn to the presence of cinema royalty on an ordinary street. Emily felt their eyes, heard the hushed whispers and the subtle clicks of smartphone cameras. Her chest tightened with a familiar anxiety, the same feeling that accompanied her into every doctor's appointment. "How much?" Meryl asked simply. Emily hesitated. The portrait was priced at $300, already higher than she'd initially dared to ask, but necessary given her mounting medical bills. $300, she said, the amount suddenly sounding absurdly small in the presence of someone whose films had grossed billions. What happened next would replay in Emily's mind countless times in the days and weeks to follow. Meryl opened her elegant handbag, removed not cash but a checkbook, an almost antiquated sight in the age of digital payments, and uncapped a pen. With deliberate strokes, she wrote, the scratch of pen against paper audible even amid the street noise. When she tore the check free and handed it to Emily, the amount written there seemed impossible. I don't understand, Emily stammered, certain she was misreading the figure. $75,000. There must be some mistake. No mistake, Meryl replied, her expression warm but firm. Art that speaks truth deserves to be valued. This piece speaks to me. Emily's vision blurred, tears threatening to spill over. The treatment options her oncologist had described just yesterday, the ones her insurance wouldn't cover, the ones that might mean the difference between life and death, suddenly shifted from impossible to within reach. A woman nearby gasped, having glimpsed the amount. Did she just? 75,000, confirmed a man in a business suit, his own expression stunned. For a street portrait. The murmurs intensified, the crowd growing larger. Someone started live-streaming the encounter, narrating in excited whispers. Meryl Streep just bought artwork from this young artist for $75,000. This is incredible. Emily's fingers closed around the check, reality bending around her. Through the tears now flowing freely, she looked up at Meryl, whose expression remained remarkably grounded amid the growing chaos. I don't know what to say, Emily managed. Your art. Already said it, Meryl replied, her hand briefly touching Emily's shoulder. Sometimes life takes everything from us. What matters is what we create from what remains. With those words, the actress nodded once more, a gesture somehow both regal and intimate, before turning to leave. The crowd parted instinctively, phones still recording, as Meryl walked away with characteristic grace. Emily stood motionless, the check in her hand more than paper and ink. It was possibility. It was tomorrow. It was breath when she'd been drowning. Around her, the world erupted in questions and exclamations, in disbelief and wonder. And somewhere, in that chaotic moment, Emily knew nothing would ever be the same again. 6 months earlier, Emily sat in a sterile examination room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the white walls. Her fingers twisted the thin paper gown covering her legs as she waited. The clock on the wall ticked methodically, each second stretching into what felt like minutes. Emily had always been healthy, athletic even, running half marathons and teaching yoga on weekends while pursuing her art degree. The persistent fatigue and unexplained bruising had seemed like nothing at first, just the result of pushing herself too hard in her final semester. The blood work is conclusive, Dr. Patel said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was gentle but direct as he took the seat across from her. Emily, you have acute myeloid leukemia. The words hung in the air between them. Emily heard them, clearly understood each one individually, but together they refused to form a coherent reality. Leukemia, she repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. But I'm only 22. Dr. Patel nodded, compassion evident in his eyes. Cancer doesn't discriminate by age, unfortunately. The good news is that we caught it relatively early, and there are excellent treatment protocols for your specific type. Emily's mind raced ahead to logistics. She had 1 semester left at the prestigious Rhode Island School of Design. Her first solo exhibition was scheduled for spring. Her tiny apartment's rent was due next week. How soon do we need to start treatment? She asked, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Immediately, Dr. Patel replied without hesitation. AML is aggressive. We need to begin chemotherapy within the next few days. The room seemed to shrink around her. And how long will treatment last? The initial intensive phase will be about a month in hospital. Then we'll evaluate and likely continue with several more rounds of consolidation therapy. He paused, giving her a moment to absorb this. Emily, you need to understand. This will require you to put everything else on hold for a while. Everything, her education, her art, the life she had carefully constructed. I'll need to call my parents, she said quietly. The phone conversation that followed was the first of many difficult moments. Her parents, living in a small town in Michigan, were devastated. They wanted to come immediately, to help however they could. Emily could hear her mother crying in the background as her father took notes on treatment details. What about insurance? Her father finally asked, the question she had been dreading. Emily closed her eyes. Her student insurance covered basic care but had high deductibles and limited coverage for serious conditions. I'm checking into that, she answered, knowing already that the coverage would be insufficient. 2 days later, Emily sat across from the hospital's financial counselor, a kind-faced woman named Marissa, who spoke in carefully measured tones. With your current insurance, the out-of-pocket costs will be substantial, Marissa explained, sliding a paper across the desk. This is an estimate for the first phase of treatment only. Emily stared at the number. $87,000. The figure seemed Abstract, impossible like trying to count stars. And the full treatment course? Marissa hesitated. Potentially 3 to 4 times that amount, depending on your response and whether you need a bone marrow transplant. Emily felt the room tilt slightly. Her entire college fund, carefully saved by her parents over decades, supplemented by scholarships, had been $120,000. Her medical costs would eclipse her entire education. There are assistance programs, Marissa continued. Payment plans. I can help you apply. Emily nodded mechanically, accepting the stack of forms while something cold and heavy settled in her stomach. That evening, her parents arrived at her small apartment, their faces tired from the long drive but determined. Emily watched as they surveyed her space, the canvases stacked against walls, the makeshift studio in what should have been a dining area, brushes soaking in jars of murky water. Her mother's eyes lingered on a half-finished portrait before pulling Emily into a fierce hug. "We'll figure this out," her mother whispered. "We always do." But as days passed and treatment began, the brutal reality became clearer. Emily's parents had remortgaged their modest home to help with initial costs. Her father, a high school art teacher, picked up evening classes. Her mother took a second job at the local grocery store. And still it wasn't enough. The chemotherapy was even harder than Emily had imagined. The nausea came in relentless waves. Her hair, long chestnut waves she'd always been proud of, began coming out in clumps, until finally she asked a nurse to shave it all off. She lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks, but worst of all was the crushing fatigue, a bone-deep exhaustion that made even lifting a pencil to sketch feel impossible. "Your blood counts are responding well," Dr. Patel told her, a month into treatment. "But we need to continue with at least 2 more rounds of consolidation therapy." Emily nodded, too tired to speak. On the chair beside her bed, her mother's face tightened with worry. Not just medical worry now, but financial. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion, Emily opened her laptop. The hospital Wi-Fi was spotty, but she managed to access her bank account. $842 remained. Her student loans were deferred, but interest still accumulated. Medical bills arrived daily. Her parents hadn't said anything, but she'd overheard her father on the phone with the bank, his voice strained as he discussed loan options. Emily closed the laptop and turned toward the window. Outside, Manhattan glittered, indifferent to her struggles. She had come to New York with such dreams, to create art that moved people, to make her mark on the world. Now she just wanted to survive. The next morning, Emily woke with first light and reached for her sketchbook, the one activity that still connected her to herself. Her hands were shakier now, but as she began to draw, something crystallized within her. She sketched her own reflection in the hospital window, unflinchingly documenting the changes in her appearance. Then she drew her mother sleeping in the uncomfortable chair, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. These weren't just sketches, they were truth. And truth, Emily suddenly realized, had value. When her parents arrived later that morning, Emily had made her decision. "I'm going to sell my art," she announced, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "On the street, in the park, online, anywhere I can. My paintings, my drawings, all of it." Her father started to protest, but Emily cut him off. "This is my fight too," she said firmly, "and art is the only weapon I have." The autumn wind whipped through Washington Square Park, carrying fallen leaves in spiraling eddies around Emily's feet as she carefully arranged her paintings against the metal fence. Her hands trembled slightly, partly from the chill, partly from the lingering effects of her most recent round of chemo. 3 weeks had passed since her discharge from the E.I.C. hospital, and though her body remained weak, her determination had only grown stronger. "You sure about this, honey?" her mother asked, adjusting Emily's knitted beanie, a gift from a nurse, to cover her ears from the biting wind. "You should be resting." Emily straightened a landscape painting of the Michigan lake where she'd spent childhood summers. "I've rested enough, Mom. The bills aren't going to pay themselves." She had chosen her location strategically, the northwest corner of the park, where art students from NYU often passed between classes and tourists wandered after visiting nearby attractions. A small handwritten sign leaned against the fence. "Art for cancer treatment. Every purchase helps." Below that, in smaller letters, "Yes, the artist is the patient." Her parents had wanted to stay, but Emily insisted they return to their hotel. Their presence, while comforting, made her feel like a patient rather than an artist. Today, she needed to be the latter. The first hour passed without a single sale. People walked by, some slowing to glance at her work, but most continued without pausing. Emily watched their expressions, a flicker of interest, then hesitation, sometimes a sympathetic smile before they moved on. A few dropped dollar bills into the small jar labeled donations, but no one purchased an actual painting. By noon, her legs ached from standing. She had brought a folding chair but refused to use it, feeling that standing projected more professionalism. The October sun provided little warmth, and Emily found herself shivering despite layers of clothing. She unwrapped a protein bar, one of the few foods her stomach could still tolerate, and chewed it slowly, determined to maintain her energy. How much for this one? Emily turned to find a middle-aged man in a business suit pointing to a small oil painting of a New York dawn, the cityscape bathed in shades of gold and amber. 300, she answered, heart quickening at the prospect of her first customer. The man's eyebrows rose. That's steep for street art. Emily swallowed her disappointment. It's original oil on canvas. I'm a RISD student, was before my diagnosis. He studied the painting a moment longer, then handed it back. It's nice work, but I was thinking more. Like $50. Art students are a dime a dozen in this city. She watched him walk away, frustration burning in her chest. 300 wasn't steep. It was barely minimum wage considering the hours she'd invested. But she couldn't afford to lower her prices, not with medical bills mounting daily. By 3 o'clock, dark clouds had gathered overhead. Emily had made exactly $38 in donations and sold nothing. Her body ached, fatigue settling into her bones, like lead. Just as she decided to pack up early, the first raindrops fell, fat, cold splashes that quickly intensified into a steady downpour. No, she muttered, scrambling to protect her artwork. Water was already seeping into the corners of her canvases, blurring careful brushstrokes. A particularly large drawing, rendered in charcoal and colored pencil, began to run, the image of a ballet dancer dissolving before her eyes. Tears mingled with raindrops on her face as she struggled to save what she could. A sudden gust of wind knocked over her easel, sending her featured painting face down into a puddle. Need help? Emily looked up to find a young woman holding an umbrella over both of them. Without waiting for an answer, she began gathering paintings, shielding them with her body. There's a coffee shop around the corner. Let's get these inside before they're ruined. 10 minutes later, Emily sat at a small table in the warm cafe, her salvaged artwork propped against nearby chairs to dry. The stranger, who had introduced herself as Katie, returned with 2 steaming cups. Hot chocolate, she explained, sliding one toward Emily. Always helps after getting caught in the rain. Thank you, Emily said, wrapping her cold fingers around the mug. For everything. I would have lost most of them. Katie studied the paintings with genuine interest. These are incredible. The techniques, the emotional depth. You're seriously talented. Emily managed a small smile. Talented but broke. Not exactly the dream. You mentioned treatment on your sign, Katie said carefully. Cancer. Leukemia. AML. The words felt less strange now, though no less devastating. Insurance covers about half. I'm trying to make up the difference. Katie's expression shifted, a new intensity in her gaze. I'm a blogger. I cover arts and culture in the city, but I also do human interest stories. Would you mind if I interviewed you? Your story, art is literal survival, it's powerful. Emily hesitated. She hadn't wanted pity, hadn't wanted her illness to define her artwork, but practicality won out. What would that involve? Just talking, maybe some photos of you with your work. I'd share your story, links to buy your art online. You do have an online presence, right? Emily shook her head. We'll fix that immediately, Katie declared, pulling out her laptop. Every artist needs a digital portfolio now. For the next 2 hours, as rain continued to pelt the windows, Katie helped Emily create a simple website with images of her paintings and a brief artist statement. They set up payment processing through PayPal and linked it to Emily's account. Katie photographed each salvageable piece, insisting on proper lighting and angles. "Your art tells stories," Katie observed as she typed. "That's what sells, not just technique but emotion, the connection between artist and viewer." By evening, Emily had her first digital presence as an artist. Katie's blog post, "The Art of Survival, How One Young Painter is Fighting Cancer One Canvas at a Time," was scheduled to publish the following morning. "This might not change everything overnight," Katie cautioned as they packed up. "But it's a start." Emily nodded, exhausted but feeling something she hadn't felt in months: hope. The next morning, Emily woke to her phone buzzing insistently. Notifications flooded her screen: emails, PayPal alerts, social media mentions. Katie's post had gone live at 6 a.m. and had already been shared hundreds of times. More incredibly, 3 paintings had sold overnight, online, to people she'd never met. Emily stared at the PayPal balance, $950, nearly $1,000, while she slept. With shaking hands, she called her parents' hotel room. "Mom," she said when her mother answered, voice thick with emotion, "I think this might actually work." That afternoon, Emily returned to Washington Square Park with her remaining paintings. This time she brought her chair. This time she added a small sign, "As featured on New York Culture Today." This time people stopped. By sunset, she had sold 4 more paintings and taken commissions for 2 others. As she packed up her greatly lightened display, Emily realized something had shifted. The art hadn't changed, her situation hadn't changed, but something else had: the story behind the paintings. People weren't just buying art. They were connecting with her journey. As Emily walked home that evening, her earnings safely deposited, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she could paint her way through this after all. 2 months had passed since Katie's blog post transformed Emily's quiet struggle into a modestly successful endeavor. The initial surge of support had settled into a steady rhythm, enough sales to help with medical bills, though far from enough to cover everything. Emily had established a routine, setting up her stand 3 days a week when her energy permitted, working on commissions from her bed on days when standing was impossible. Today was a good day, physically speaking. Her latest round of chemo had ended 10 days ago, which meant she was in that narrow window where the nausea had subsided, but the profound fatigue hadn't yet fully descended. Emily carefully arranged her newest paintings along the fence in Washington Square Park, her display more professional now, with a proper easel and weatherproof coverings for unexpected rain. "You're the cancer artist, right?" asked a teenage girl who stopped to examine a watercolor of the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset. Emily smiled politely, having grown accustomed to the label. "I'm an artist who happens to have cancer, yes." The girl nodded, snapping a photo of Emily's display with her phone. "I follow you on Instagram. My aunt had leukemia too." She hesitated before adding, "She didn't make it." "I'm sorry," Emily replied softly. "Your art helps people, you know, not just yourself." The girl handed her $20 for a small print. "It reminds us there's beauty even in the hard stuff." As the girl walked away, Emily pondered her words. When she'd started selling her art, it had been purely practical, a desperate attempt to fund her treatment. She hadn't considered the impact her story might have on others navigating their own pain. By midday, Emily had sold 3 originals and several prints. Her Instagram following had grown to just over 5,000, modest by influencer standards, but remarkable for someone who'd been completely unknown 3 months ago. Occasionally, customers recognized her from social media or Katie's follow-up articles. Some shared their own cancer stories. Others simply said they were rooting for her. Emily was wrapping a painting for a customer when she noticed a woman standing slightly apart from the others, observing her with unusual intensity. Unlike the casual park visitors, this woman was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal pantsuit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Something about her demeanor suggested purpose rather than curiosity. After the customer left, The woman approached. "Emily Wells." Her voice was crisp, professional. "I'm Victoria Carrington, arts editor for The New Yorker." Emily nearly dropped. The cash box she'd been organizing. The New Yorker was no small cultural blog. It was one of the most prestigious publications in the country. "I've been following your story," Victoria continued. "Your work shows remarkable promise, especially considering your circumstances." "Thank you," Emily managed, trying to process what was happening. Victoria gestured to the paintings. "These are good. Your technique is solid. But I've seen your hospital series online. The self-portraits during treatment, the nurses, the other patients. That work is exceptional, raw, unflinching, deeply human." Emily swallowed hard. The hospital series was her most personal work, drawings, and small paintings she'd created during treatment, often in the middle of sleepless, pain-filled nights. She'd posted them online but hadn't brought them to sell. They felt too intimate, too exposing. "I'd like to feature you in our emerging artists profile next month," Victoria said. "Not as a human interest story, but as a serious artistic talent. The fact that you're creating meaningful work while fighting cancer adds context, but your art stands on its own merits." Emily's heart raced. "You want to feature my work in The New Yorker?" "Yes, and I'd like you to consider allowing the hospital series to be the centerpiece." Victoria handed her a business card. "Think about it. This could be significant for your career." After Victoria left, Emily sat on her folding chair, the business card clutched in her trembling hand. A feature in The New Yorker would change everything, bringing legitimacy, attention from galleries, possibly even serious collectors. That evening, as Emily entered her apartment building, the property manager called out to her. "Wells, package came for you, too big for your mailbox." Emily frowned, not remembering ordering anything. The manager handed her a long cardboard tube with no return address. Inside, she found a high-quality canvas rolled carefully with a note. Tucked inside, "Your work deserves the best materials. Keep painting your truth." An admirer. The canvas was museum grade, the kind Emily could never afford on her own. Someone who had seen her story had sent not money, but tools for her to continue creating. The gesture moved her deeply. Later, as Emily lay in bed reviewing the day's sales on her laptop, an email notification appeared. The subject line made her sit upright. "Invitation to participate. Whitney Museum Young Artists Showcase." The Whitney Museum of American Art was inviting her to submit work for consideration in their annual Emerging Artists exhibition. The email mentioned Victoria's recommendation, explaining that while the selection process was typically completed months earlier, they were making a special exception given the circumstances. "This can't be real," Emily whispered to her empty apartment, but it was. And so was the text that came through moments later from Dr. Patel. "Your latest blood work shows promising improvements. Let's discuss next steps tomorrow." Emily set down her phone, overwhelmed by the convergence of good news. For months she had been focused solely on survival, physical and financial. Now, unexpectedly, she faced the possibility of something more, a future, as the artist she had always dreamed of becoming. The next morning, Emily made a decision. She carefully selected the most powerful pieces from her hospital series, the raw, unflinching self-portraits that tracked her transformation, the quiet moments of despair and hope captured in confident brushstrokes. These were the works that had poured from her soul when she'd had nothing left to lose, when authenticity was her only remaining currency. She photographed each piece professionally, wrote an artist's statement that spoke honestly about creating from the edge of existence, and submitted everything to the Whitney. Then she called Victoria to accept the New Yorker feature. "I want to be seen as an artist first," Emily told her, "but I don't want to hide the cancer either. It's part of my journey, part of what shapes my perspective." "That's exactly why your work resonates," Victoria replied. "You're not exploiting your illness for sympathy. You're transforming it into something universally human. Pain, resilience, beauty in unexpected places, these are themes that transcend your specific circumstances." That afternoon, Emily returned to her spot in Washington Square Park with a new sign, "Emily Wells Artist." No mention of cancer, no appeal for help, just her name and her work, standing on their own merits. As she arranged her display, a sense of clarity washed over her. Whatever happened next, whether her health improved or deteriorated, whether recognition came or faded, she had already succeeded in the most fundamental way. She had refused to be defined by her illness. She had created work that mattered. She had transformed her struggle into something beautiful. A young man stopped to examine a cityscape. "These are amazing," he said. "Are you Emily Wells? I saw your work online." "Yes," she replied simply. "I'm Emily Wells." For the first time since her diagnosis, she felt the words were completely, unequivocally true. Emily arrived at her usual spot in Washington Square Park earlier than normal. The October morning carried a crisp brightness that felt promising, the kind of clear autumn day that made New York feel magical rather than overwhelming. Her latest blood tests had shown continued improvement. Not remission, not yet, but a trajectory that Dr. Patel called cautiously optimistic. She arranged her display with practiced efficiency, positioning her newest works prominently. The New Yorker feature had published 3 days earlier, generating a surge of interest that translated into both online sales and increased foot traffic at her park setup. Her website now included a waiting list for commissions, something that still felt surreal whenever she thought about it. "Need a hand with that easel?" Emily looked up to find Marco, a street musician who often played saxophone near her spot. They had developed a friendly camaraderie over the past months, looking out for each other's belongings during bathroom breaks and occasionally sharing snacks. "Thanks," she said, accepting his help with the stubborn folding mechanism. "How was yesterday's take?" Marco grinned, adjusting his knit cap. "Best Thursday I've had in months. Something's in the air, I think." "Good energy flowing," Emily smiled, wanting to believe him. Despite recent successes, the reality of her medical bills remained daunting. The latest treatment option Dr. Patel had suggested, an experimental protocol that showed promising results in cases like hers, wasn't covered by insurance at all. The price tag, $120,000. By 10 o'clock, the park had filled with the usual mix of tourists, students, and locals. Emily had already sold 2 small watercolors and a print when a middle-aged couple approached, examining her work with unusual focus. "You're the artist from the magazine," the woman said. "Not a question, but a statement. These are even more impressive, in person." They purchased an oil painting of the New York skyline at dawn, one of her larger, more expensive pieces, without attempting to negotiate the price. As Emily carefully wrapped their purchase, the woman leaned closer. "My sister had lymphoma 5 years ago," she said quietly. "Your hospital series, it captured something I could never explain to people who haven't been through it. Thank you for that." Emily nodded, finding words inadequate. These moments continued to surprise her, the unexpected connections formed through her most vulnerable work. As the morning progressed, sales remained steady. By noon, Emily had earned more than enough to justify the day, but something kept her from packing up early despite her growing fatigue. Marco's words echoed in her mind. Good energy flowing. At 1:30 she noticed a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change in the rhythm of passers-by, conversations dropping to whispers, people slowing their pace. Emily was adjusting a canvas when she sensed someone standing before her display. She looked up to find a woman studying her work with remarkable intensity. It took Emily several seconds to process what she was seeing. The elegant silver hair styled in a sophisticated wave, the distinctive profile that had graced countless movie posters and magazine covers, the commanding presence that somehow managed to be both approachable and regal. Meryl Streep was standing at her art display. Emily froze, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. Around them, people pretended not to stare while obviously stealing glances. A few had already raised phones discreetly. Meryl moved from one painting to the next with unhurried deliberation, studying each as if in a museum rather than a park. She paused longest before a portrait Emily had completed just after her most recent treatment. A young woman in a hospital gown, gazing out a window at a world she couldn't reach, her reflection showing determination rather than despair. "Your use of light is extraordinary," Meryl said finally, her voice exactly as Emily had heard it in countless films, warm, assured, genuine. You capture the human experience in a way that feels both personal and universal. Thank you, Emily managed, her own voice barely audible. That means a lot, especially from you. Meryl smiled, the famous eyes crinkling at the corners. Are you Emily Wells? I read about your work in the New Yorker. The revelation that Meryl Streep not only recognized her name, but had read about her work sent Emily's thoughts spinning. Yes, that's me. I'm drawn to this one, Meryl said, indicating the hospital window portrait. There's a story here. Emily hesitated. Typically, she let her art speak for itself, avoiding detailed explanations of her personal circumstances, but something about Meryl's genuine interest compelled honesty. That was painted after my 4th round of chemotherapy, she explained. There's a particular feeling that comes with illness, being simultaneously inside and outside of the world, watching life continue while yours is suspended. Meryl nodded, her expression thoughtful. I've played characters facing mortality, but that's just pretending. You're living it and transforming it into something beautiful. That's remarkable. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, watching the interaction with undisguised curiosity. Emily was acutely aware of their presence, but found herself focused entirely on the conversation. How much is this piece? Meryl asked. $300, Emily replied, the price suddenly seeming arbitrary. Meryl considered the painting for another long moment. Would you consider selling it to me? Of course, Emily said, still processing the surreal nature of the exchange. Meryl opened her handbag, an elegant, understated leather tote, and removed a checkbook and pen. I believe in supporting artists directly, she explained, especially those whose work speaks to me. Emily watched, transfixed, as Meryl began writing. The actress's hands moved with the same precision she brought to her performances, deliberate and purposeful. When she tore the check from the book and handed it to Emily, the amount written there seemed impossible. $75,000. Emily stared at the check, certain she was misreading the number. There must be a mistake, she stammered. No mistake, Meryl replied calmly. Art is worth what it means to the person acquiring it. This piece speaks to the human spirit in the face of adversity. That's valuable beyond conventional pricing. A woman nearby gasped, having glimpsed the amount. The whispers intensified. Phones appeared more openly now, capturing the moment. This isn't charity, Meryl continued, her voice dropping so that only Emily could hear. This is recognition of extraordinary talent. I've been collecting art for decades and I recognize significance when I see it. Emily's vision blurred with tears she couldn't hold back. The amount on the check was more than just money. It represented the possibility of the treatment option Dr. Patel had described, the one that insurance wouldn't cover, the one that offered her best chance. I don't know what to say, Emily managed. Your art already said everything necessary, Meryl replied with a gentle smile. Sometimes the world needs to be reminded of what truly matters. As Meryl carefully took the wrapped painting, a spontaneous burst of applause erupted from the gathered crowd. The actress acknowledged them with a gracious nod, before turning back to Emily. Keep creating, she said simply. The world needs your perspective. Then, with the same quiet dignity that characterized her screen performances, Meryl Streep turned and walked away, leaving behind a stunned Emily and a check that would change everything. Emily felt as if she were floating above the scene, watching herself from a distance as she stood motionless, the check still clutched between trembling fingers. Around her, the world had erupted into controlled chaos. Phones were raised in every direction, capturing the moment that was already spreading across social media. Strangers whispered to each other, pointing first at the departing figure of Meryl Streep, then at Emily, then at the space where the painting had been. Did that just happen? Asked Marco, who had abandoned his saxophone to rush over. Was that really Meryl Streep? Emily nodded, still unable to form words. The check in her hand felt impossibly light for something that carried such weight. A young woman pushed forward from the gathering crowd, her press badge swinging from a lanyard. I'm with Entertainment Weekly. Could I get a statement about what just happened? Before Emily could respond, another voice called out, New York Post, can we get a photo? How long have you known Meryl Streep? What did she say to you? The questions came rapid-fire now, the crowd pressing closer. Emily felt her chest tighten, the familiar anxiety spiking as oxygen seemed to thin around her. This was too much, too fast. Marco stepped between Emily and the advancing reporters. Give her some space, folks. This is still her workplace. His voice was firm but kind. A woman in a business suit approached from the side, slipping past the small barrier of onlookers. I'm Rebecca Klein, gallery owner in Chelsea. We should talk. She pressed a business card into Emily's hand before being swallowed back into the crowd. Emily carefully folded the check and tucked it into her pocket, her mind racing to catch up with reality. She needed to call her parents, needed to contact. Dr. Patel needed a moment to breathe. I think you're going to want to pack up, Marco said quietly. This isn't going to die down anytime soon. He was right. The crowd had grown larger, not smaller. Tourists who had no idea what happened were stopping to see what the commotion was about, adding to the congestion. Emily began gathering her remaining artwork with shaking hands, struggling to maintain composure as the magnitude of what had just occurred continued to sink in. Let me help you, came a gentle voice. Emily looked up to find an older woman carefully stacking prints. My daughter went through cancer treatment last year. I know that overwhelmed look. She smiled warmly. You go somewhere quiet. I'll help your friend pack this up. Emily nodded gratefully and slipped away from her display, finding temporary sanctuary on a bench, partially hidden by a large oak tree. She pulled out her phone, which was already buzzing with notifications, and called her mother. Mom, she said when the line connected, her voice breaking. Something just happened. Something impossible. Through tears, Emily recounted the encounter. Meryl Streep's appearance, her interest in the hospital window painting, the incredible amount on the check. Her mother's gasps and exclamations mirrored Emily's own disbelief. But why? Her mother asked finally. Why would she give so much? She said it wasn't charity, Emily replied, remembering Meryl's words. She said it was recognition of talent, that my art was worth it to her. There was a moment of silence before her mother spoke again, voice thick with emotion. She's right, you know. Your work is extraordinary, Emily. We've always known that. After promising to call back once she had processed everything, Emily ended the call and sat quietly, watching as Marco and the kind stranger finished packing her display. The crowd had begun to disperse, though several people lingered, clearly hoping for her return. Emily looked down at her phone to find hundreds of notifications flooding in, Instagram comments, Twitter mentions, emails from unknown addresses. A text from Katie, the blogger who had first shared her story, contained just a string of exclamation points followed by, Meryl Streep, call me. Another text arrived, this one from Dr. Patel. Just saw what happened on Twitter. My office Monday? We should discuss that treatment option now. The treatment option. $120,000 of cutting-edge experimental therapy that insurance had deemed not medically necessary, despite Dr. Patel's insistence that it offered her best chance. The treatment that had seemed like an impossible dream just hours earlier. Emily's fingers lightly touched the outline of the check in her pocket. $75,000. Not enough for the full treatment, but enough to start. Enough to hope. Marco approached, carrying her folded easel and the box containing her remaining artwork. Your chariot awaits, he said with a gentle smile, gesturing toward a waiting taxi. I figured you might want an escape route. Thank you, Emily said, accepting his help to stand. The fatigue that she had been holding at bay crashed over her suddenly, her body reminding her of its limitations, even as her mind raced with possibilities. As they approached the taxi, a well-dressed man stepped forward. Ms. Wells, I represent the Garfield Gallery on Fifth Avenue. We'd be interested in discussing representation. Before Emily could respond, another voice called out, Emily, Jasmine Lee, New York Times Art Section. Could I get just 5 minutes? Marco smoothly guided Emily into the waiting cab, handing the driver a $20 bill. Get her home safely, he instructed before turning back to Emily. Go rest. This will all still be happening tomorrow. As the taxi pulled away, Emily watched the park recede through the rear window. Her spot, just a small section of fence that she had claimed as her own these past months, looked oddly empty without her display. "Where to, miss?" the driver asked. Emily gave her address, then leaned back against the seat, exhaustion and exhilaration battling within her. The taxi radio played quietly in the background, the announcer's voice suddenly cutting through her thoughts. And in an incredible moment caught on social media today, Academy Award-winning actress Meryl Streep purchased artwork from a young cancer patient in Washington Square Park for a reported $75,000. The artist Emily Wells was recently featured. Emily reached forward and gently asked the driver to turn off the radio. She needed silence, needed space to process. As the taxi navigated through Manhattan traffic, Emily allowed herself to truly feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about money, though the financial impact was undeniable. This was about validation from one of the most respected artists in the world. This was about doors opening that had previously been firmly closed. But most of all, this was about possibility. The possibility of treatment. The possibility of survival. The possibility of a future where she was known not as the cancer patient who painted, but as the artist who happened to have overcome cancer. By the time the taxi reached her apartment building, Emily had made a decision. Tomorrow would bring interviews and attention, gallery offers and social media fame. But tonight, right now, she would paint. Because before she was anything else, before patient, before survivor, before viral sensation, she was an artist. And today, Meryl Streep had seen that truth more clearly than anyone. Emily woke the next morning to the sound of her phone vibrating itself across her nightstand. Squinting at the screen, she saw over 50 missed calls, hundreds of text messages and social media notifications that had long since stopped displaying individual numbers, replaced instead with a simple 999+. The time was 7:38 a.m. She had slept nearly 12 hours, her body claiming the rest it desperately needed after yesterday's emotional tsunami. Still half asleep, she scrolled through the notifications. Messages from old classmates, childhood friends, former professors, and countless strangers. Everyone, it seemed, had seen what happened in Washington Square Park. With trembling fingers, she opened Twitter. Her name was trending at number 3 nationally, just below a political scandal and above a celebrity breakup. The top video, shared over 300,000 times already, showed the moment Meryl handed her the check, captured from the perspective of someone standing several feet away. Emily's shocked expression was clearly visible, as was Meryl's gentle smile. Meryl. Streep just changed this cancer patient's life with a $75K purchase of her artwork. This is what using privilege and wealth for good looks like. The caption made Emily wince slightly. She had never wanted to be seen primarily as a cancer patient, but the sentiment behind it was undeniable. The comments section overflowed with emotional responses. "I'm literally sobbing right now. This is how you use fame responsibly. Did you see the painting? It's incredible. This wasn't charity." A text from Katie arrived as she was reading, "CNN wants to interview you. Call me ASAP. CNN." The reality of what was happening began to solidify. This wasn't just a viral moment. This was becoming a national story. Emily forced herself out of bed, moving to the small kitchenette to make tea. Her laptop sat on the counter where she had left it last night after depositing Meryl's check electronically, a surreal experience that had required her to call the bank's customer service to verify that yes, this was a legitimate transaction. Opening the laptop, Emily found her email inbox had exploded. Sorting through the chaos, certain messages stood out. From the Whitney Museum. "In light of recent events, we would like to expedite your application process for the Young Artists Showcase. From a major publishing house, interested in discussing a potential art book featuring your hospital series. From a National Cancer Research Foundation. Would you consider becoming an ambassador for young adult cancer awareness?" Most strikingly, there were emails from 5 separate art galleries, each expressing interest in representing her work. The Garfield Gallery, one of the most prestigious in Manhattan, had already sent a proposed contract for her review. Emily's hands shook as she sipped her tea. 24 hours ago, she had been a promising but struggling artist selling work in a park to fund her medical treatments. Now, the art world was opening doors she hadn't expected to approach for years, if ever. Her phone rang, Her parents. "Number," she answered to hear her mother's tearful voice. "Emily, have you seen the Today Show? They're talking about you right now." Emily fumbled for the remote, turning on her small television just in time to catch the tail end of the segment. Footage of her and Meryl played while the hosts discussed the heartwarming moment and incredible gesture. A photo from her Instagram account filled the screen, one of her hospital self-portraits, showing her with newly bald head, paintbrush in hand. According to sources, Miss Streep became aware of Emily Wells' work through a recent New Yorker profile highlighting emerging artists, the host explained. What happened next has captured America's heart. Emily muted the television, feeling suddenly disconnected from the person they were discussing. It was her name, her story, her art, but the narrative was already taking on a life of its own, shaped by hands other than hers. Her phone continued its relentless buzzing. A text from Dr. Patel. "Your story is inspiring many patients here. When you're ready, let's talk about that treatment option." That grounded her. Amid the surreal whirlwind of sudden fame, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. She was still fighting cancer. The check, now safely deposited, represented not just recognition, but literal survival. A knock at her door startled her. Through the peephole, she saw her neighbor Susan, an elderly woman who had occasionally brought her soup during the worst days of chemo. "I saw you on the news," Susan said when Emily opened the door. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay. Fame can be as overwhelming as illness in its way." The simple kindness of this check-in brought tears to Emily's eyes. "I'm a little lost," she admitted. Susan nodded. "You need a gatekeeper, someone to help you sort through all this." She gestured vaguely toward Emily's phone, which was buzzing again. "Don't try to answer everyone. Choose carefully." After Susan left, Emily followed. Her advice. She texted Katie, who had media experience, and asked her to come over as soon as possible. She called her parents and asked them to fly in from Michigan. She emailed Dr. Patel to schedule an appointment for Monday. Then she turned off her phone, silenced the notifications on her laptop, and did the one thing that had always centered her. She painted. 3 hours later, Katie arrived, armed with a notebook and determined expression. "You've gone supernova," she announced. "Let me show you what's happening." She pulled out her tablet, displaying headlines from around the country. Meryl Streep's 75K act of kindness toward cancer-stricken artist goes viral. Artist survival, how Emily Wells. Hospital paintings caught Meryl Streep's eye. The painting worth $75,000. What Meryl Streep saw in this young artist's work. Most surprisingly, Katie showed her a post from the official Meryl Streep Instagram account, rarely updated and carefully curated. It showed the painting, now hanging on what appeared to be a warmly lit living room wall. The caption read simply, "Art speaks when words fail. Honored to have this piece by Haute Emily Wells Art in my home. Support young artists." The post had over 2 million likes already. "LeBron James asked if you consider a commission," Katie said, scrolling through her notes. "Ellen wants you on the show next week. The Met is inquiring about acquiring pieces for their contemporary collection. Oh, and 16 different cancer organizations have reached out about fundraising collaborations." Emily sank onto her sofa, overwhelmed. "I just wanted to pay for my treatment," she whispered. Katie sat beside her, taking her hand. "You've become something bigger than yourself overnight. A symbol of art's power, of human connection, of hope in the face of impossible odds." She squeezed Emily's fingers gently. "But remember, beneath all that, you're still just Emily, the artist who paints what she sees and feels." Emily nodded, grateful for the reminder. "What do I do now?" "First, we protect you," Katie said firmly. "Your health comes first, physical and mental. We limit interviews, choose partnerships carefully, and make sure this serves your actual needs, not just what everyone wants from you." They spent the next hours crafting a strategy. Emily would do one major television interview, prioritize legitimate art world opportunities over celebrity attention, and use her platform to address cancer treatment costs without becoming solely defined by her illness. As evening fell, Emily stood at her window, watching the city lights emerge. Her phone, turned back on briefly, showed an incoming text from an unknown number. The true measure of art is not in its viral reach, but in its ability to speak truth. Yours does both. Wishing you health and continued inspiration. Miss Meryl. Somehow, amid the chaos, she had found a way to reach out personally. Emily smiled, feeling for the first time that perhaps she could navigate this strange new reality. The explosion of attention would eventually subside, but the doors it had opened, to treatment, to artistic recognition, to a future she had feared might be stolen from her, those would remain. Tomorrow would bring more chaos. But tonight, in the quiet of her apartment, Emily Wells was simply an artist holding on to the truth of who she was beneath the viral storm. 1 month after Meryl Streep walked into her life, Emily stood in the center of her new studio space, still unable to fully believe it was hers. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the eastern wall, illuminating the high ceilings and polished concrete floors. Canvases in various stages of completion leaned against the walls, while her supplies, once crammed into her tiny apartment's closet, now occupied a custom-built storage system along the back wall. The studio was on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, a space she never could have afforded before. But everything had changed now. Emily ran her fingers along a workbench, feeling the smooth surface beneath her touch. Her life had reorganized itself with dizzying speed, rearranging into something she scarcely recognized, yet somehow had always imagined. "Still getting used to it?" asked David, her newly acquired manager. He stood in the doorway, his ever-present tablet in hand. Emily nodded. "It feels like someone else's life." "Well, that someone else has a meeting with the Covington Gallery at 2 and Dr. Patel at 4:30. He glanced at his watch. "Which gives you exactly 3 hours of painting time before you need to get ready." This was another change, having someone to handle the business aspects of her suddenly complex life. David had come highly recommended by Victoria from The New Yorker, who insisted Emily needed professional representation immediately. He managed several mid-career artists and had experience navigating both the art world and media attention. "The Yuan treatment is working," Emily said almost to herself. "Dr. Patel says my numbers are better than they've been since diagnosis." The experimental protocol had begun 2 weeks after the viral encounter. The first round had been brutal, worse than any previous treatment, but the results were promising. Her cancer was responding, the aggressive cells retreating in the face of the cutting-edge therapy that Meryl's check had made possible. David smiled. "That's the real victory in all this." As he left, Emily turned to her current work in progress, a large canvas dominated by shades of amber and gold, depicting hands, releasing paper lanterns into a night sky. It was part of her new series, focusing on moments of hope discovered in darkness. Her phone chimed with a familiar notification sound. The Emily Wells Art Foundation's Instagram account had just surpassed 1 million followers. The foundation, established, with a portion of the proceeds from her suddenly lucrative art sales, provided financial support to young artists facing medical crises. Emily had insisted on this purpose from the beginning, transforming her viral moment into something that could help others facing the same impossible choices she had confronted. At exactly noon, Emily's phone rang with her mother's daily check-in call. "The contractor finished the downstairs bathroom," her mother reported happily. "Your father is already planning where to put his woodworking equipment in the garage." Another life-changing result of the past month. Emily had paid off her parents' mortgage and funded the home renovations they had postponed for decades while raising her and paying for her education. It was the first thing she had done when the money from gallery sales and commissions began flowing in. "I'm flying you both out next week for the gallery opening," Emily reminded her. "First class all the way." "We don't need first class," her mother protested weakly, a conversation they'd had several times before. "You deserve it," Emily replied simply. "Let me give you this." After the call, Emily returned to her painting, losing herself in the work until David returned to remind her of her appointments. As she cleaned her brushes, her gaze fell on the small framed note hanging beside her workspace, the handwritten message from Meryl Streep that had arrived with a bouquet of lilies the day after Emily's first television interview. Authenticity. is the rarest form of courage. Keep speaking your truth through art. The Covington Gallery meeting went smoothly. They were eager to feature Emily's work in their upcoming spring showcase. The gallery director, a woman with impeccable credentials and intimidating knowledge of art history, spoke about Emily's technique with genuine respect. There was no mention of cancer, no reference to Meryl Streep. Just serious discussion about brushwork, composition, and artistic vision. This too was part of the transformation. Increasingly, Emily was being recognized for her art itself, not just her story. Critics were writing about her distinctive perspective and masterful use of light. A renowned art professor at Columbia had reached out about guest lecturing for his graduate seminar. The meeting with Dr. Patel offered equally encouraging news. The latest scan showed significant reduction in her cancer. Not remission, not yet, but movement in the right direction. "The protocol is working exactly as we'd hoped," he said, genuine pleasure warming his professional demeanor. "Your body is responding remarkably well." Emily studied the scan images, trying to reconcile the abstract patterns on the screen with the very concrete reality of her survival. "And if it continues like this?" "Then we discuss long-term plans rather than emergency interventions," Dr. Patel replied. "For the first time since your diagnosis, Emily, I feel comfortable using the word future without qualifications." Future. Such a simple word that had seemed so tenuous just weeks ago. That evening, Emily attended a small dinner party hosted by Victoria from The New Yorker. The guests included gallery owners, established artists, and cultural critics, the kind of gathering Emily would have once found intimidating. Now she moved through the space with growing confidence, discussing her work and listening to others with genuine interest. "Emily, have you heard from Meryl recently?" asked a curator from the Whitney, the question posed casually over dessert. "We exchange emails occasionally," Emily replied, maintaining the privacy she'd established around this relationship. What she didn't share was that Meryl had become something of a mentor, offering quiet guidance on navigating sudden fame and remaining authentic as an artist. Later that night, as her taxi crossed the bridge back to Brooklyn, Emily watched the Manhattan skyline glittering against the dark water. She remembered painting this same view from her hospital window, uncertain if she'd live to see another season change. The transformation of her external circumstances, from struggling artist to rising star, from financial desperation to security, was obvious. But the deeper change was internal. Cancer had taught her the precariousness of existence. Meryl's unexpected intervention had shown her how quickly life could transform. Together, these lessons had crystallized into a new understanding. Nothing was permanent, neither suffering nor success. In her new studio, Emily stood before the lantern painting, adding touches of light to the darkness. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Just saw your interview online, so proud of you, Emmy." Emily smiled at the childhood nickname. For all that had changed, some things remained beautifully constant. On a small table beside her easel sat a sketch for her. Next major work, a portrait of Meryl Streep. Not as the celebrated actress or cultural icon, but as the woman who had stopped at a street display, looked at a painting, and seen its true value. Emily had been working on preliminary studies for weeks, trying to capture not just Meryl's familiar features but the essence of that moment, the genuine connection between two artists, one established and one emerging, linked by respect for the truth art could tell. The portrait would be her gift to Meryl, a completion of the circle that had begun in Washington Square Park. Not for publicity or attention, but as acknowledgement of how one person's decision to stop and truly see another can transform everything. Emily added one final highlight to the lanterns rising into the painted sky. Tomorrow would bring more appointments, more opportunities, more decisions. But tonight, in the sacred space of her studio, Emily Wells was exactly where she was meant to be, creating art that spoke truth about the human experience of falling and rising, of darkness and light, of transformation against all odds. 6 months after the life-changing encounter in Washington Square Park, Emily sat nervously in the back of a town car as it wound through the narrow roads of upstate New York. Outside the window, Autumn had painted the landscape in brilliant golds and crimsons, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital rooms that had dominated her life this time last year. "We'll be arriving in about 10 minutes, Ms. Wells," the driver announced, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. Emily nodded, checking her reflection in her compact mirror. Her hair had begun growing back, forming a soft pixie cut that framed her face. The experimental treatment had worked better than even Dr. Patel had anticipated, pushing her cancer into what he cautiously termed significant remission. She still had monthly appointments and occasional days of bone-deep fatigue, but for the first time since her diagnosis, Emily was making plans that extended beyond her next hospital visit, plans that now included this unexpected invitation. 3 days earlier, Emily had received a call from Meryl Streep's personal assistant. The actress was filming on location at a historic estate 2 hours north of the city and wanted to invite Emily to visit the set. "Mrs. Streep specifically mentioned she'd like to see how you're doing and discuss your recent work," the assistant had explained. The car turned through imposing wrought-iron gates and proceeded up a tree-lined drive toward a magnificent stone manor house. Production trucks and equipment were strategically positioned around the property, and crew members moved with purposeful efficiency across the grounds. Emily spotted the unmistakable shape of lighting rigs and camera equipment near the eastern wing of the mansion. A young woman with a headset and clipboard approached as Emily stepped from the car. "Ms. Wells? I'm Jenna, Ms. Streep's assistant. Welcome to Hawthorne Estate. They're just finishing a scene, so Ms. Streep will be available in about 20 minutes. Would you like to watch from the monitors while you wait?" Emily nodded, following Jenna through the side entrance of the mansion and into what had once been a formal dining room, now transformed into a makeshift production hub. Several screens displayed the same image, a wood-paneled library where Meryl, dressed in 1940s attire, was engaged in intense conversation with her co-star. Even on the small monitor, her command of the scene was mesmerizing. "She's playing Eleanor Wilson, a war correspondent who risked her life documenting the liberation of concentration camps," Jenna explained quietly. "The film's based on a true story." Emily watched, transfixed, as Meryl delivered an emotionally complex monologue about bearing witness to history's darkest moments. The director called cut, and the room around Emily burst into applause. "She's requested that you meet in her private trailer," Jenna said, gesturing toward the door. "She prefers conversations away from the bustle of set when possible." 10 minutes later, Emily found herself climbing the steps of an elegant trailer positioned at the edge of the estate grounds, overlooking a small lake. She raised her hand to knock, but the door opened before her knuckles made contact. "Emily." Meryl greeted her warmly, still in costume but with her hair now freed from its period styling. "I'm so glad you could come." The interior was unexpectedly modest, comfortable but not extravagant. A small seating area, a compact kitchen space, a dressing area partially concealed by a screen. What caught Emily's attention, however, was the painting, her painting, prominently displayed on the wall opposite a small sofa. "You brought it to set," Emily said, surprised to see the hospital window portrait in this temporary space. Meryl smiled, following her gaze. "Kaya travels with me to every location. There's something about the quality of hope in it, the looking outward from a place of confinement. It helps me connect with characters who are facing impossible circumstances." She gestured for Emily to sit and poured 2 cups of tea from a ceramic pot. "But I'm more interested in hearing about you, your new work, your health." For the next hour, they talked with surprising ease, not as celebrity and fan, not as benefactor and recipient, but as 2 artists discussing craft and purpose. Emily shared details about her experimental treatment, the promising prognosis, the foundation she had established to help other artists facing medical crises. "The organization has provided grants to 12 artists so far," Emily explained, "ranging from painters to musicians to writers, all facing serious health challenges without adequate resources. You've transformed a moment of good fortune into her structure for ongoing change," Meryl observed. "That's remarkably wise." Emily smiled. "I learned something important from our encounter. It wasn't just about the money, though that literally saved my life. It was about being truly seen. Everyone deserves that." Meryl nodded, her expression thoughtful. In my career, I've tried to make characters visible who might otherwise be overlooked. It's not so different from what you do with your art. She rose and moved to a portfolio case leaning against the wall. Your manager sent these images of your recent work. I hope you don't mind. This series in particular. She withdrew several prints of Emily's latest paintings, studies of human connection in unlikely circumstances, speaks to something essential about resilience. Emily watched as Meryl examined the images with the same focused attention she had given the original painting in Washington Square Park. There was no pretense in her interest, no performative appreciation. "I'd like to commission a piece," Meryl said finally, "for my permanent collection, not just the traveling one." She smiled, gesturing toward Emily's hospital window painting on the wall. Something that captures what happens after looking out. That window. When the person confined finds their way back into the world forever changed by what they've seen. Emily felt a spark of creative electricity at the request. "I'd be honored." "Take your time," Meryl said. "The most meaningful work can't be rushed." Their conversation shifted then, moving beyond art to books they had both loved, places they hoped to visit, the challenges of maintaining authenticity in public life. Never once did Meryl treat Emily as anything less than a peer, younger certainly, at a different point in her career, but worthy of respect on her own merits. As their meeting drew to a close, a soft knock at the door signaled that Meryl was needed back on set. They stood, and Emily was surprised when Meryl embraced her. "Your foundation's gala next month," Meryl said, stepping back. "I'd like to attend, if the invitation remains open." Emily had sent the invitation weeks ago, never truly expecting a response. "Of course, we'd be honored, and perhaps I could say a few words? Not about that day in the park, but about the importance of art as truth-telling, about why societies must value their artists, especially in difficult times." "That would be incredible," Emily replied, already imagining the impact Meryl's presence would have on fundraising for the foundation. As they walked together toward the set, several crew members glanced their way with undisguised curiosity. Emily realized that despite the media coverage of their initial encounter, few people understood the relationship that had developed. Not mentor and protege exactly, not friends in the conventional sense, but something equally meaningful. Two artists recognizing something essential in each other, across the divides of age, experience, and circumstance. "The commission," Meryl said as they reached the library set. "There's no timeline. I want it to come when it feels right to you." Emily nodded, understanding the gift contained in those words, not just the commission itself, but the freedom to approach it on her own terms when she was ready. "Thank you," Emily said simply, "not just for today, but for seeing the painting that day, for stopping when others walked past." Meryl's smile was warm, but her eyes were serious. "That's all any of us really want, isn't it? To be seen for who we truly are." As Emily left the set that afternoon, the weight of expectation she had carried, to be sufficiently impressive, sufficiently grateful, sufficiently worthy of Meryl's interest, had lifted. In its place was something more valuable, the certainty that their connection, however unlikely its beginning, was rooted in mutual respect and a shared understanding of art's power to transform experience into meaning. 1 year to the day after, Meryl Streep stopped at her art stand in Washington Square Park. Emily Wells stood in the center of the Covington Gallery, surrounded by the culmination of her journey. The exhibition, titled Thresholds, featured 35 pieces chronicling her path from diagnosis through treatment to recovery, not as a medical narrative, but as a deeply human exploration of transformation. Dressed in a simple midnight blue gown that complemented her now chin-length hair, Emily observed the crowded space with quiet amazement. Art critics conversed with celebrities, medical professionals mingled with gallery owners, and scattered throughout were faces she recognized from her treatment days: nurses, fellow patients, the elderly couple who had purchased her first painting, in the rain. "5 minutes until the formal opening," David murmured, appearing at her elbow. "The press is already stationed. Are you ready?" Emily nodded, her gaze drawn to the exhibition's centerpiece, still concealed behind elegant draping. The commissioned portrait of Meryl Streep that she had spent months perfecting. Unlike traditional portraiture, Emily had chosen to depict not just Meryl's instantly recognizable features, but the moment of genuine seeing, capturing the actress in the act of discovering Emily's art that fateful day. The painting reflected, in her eyes, the connection forming between viewer and creator. "She's here," David said softly. "Just arrived through the private entrance." Emily turned to see Meryl making her way through the gallery, elegant in understated black, pausing to examine each piece with authentic interest rather than social obligation. Several guests noticed her presence, but something in her demeanor, the focused attention she gave to the artwork, discouraged interruption. At precisely 8 o'clock, the gallery director stepped to the center of the room, gently tapping a glass for attention. "Welcome to this extraordinary exhibition," she began, her voice carrying through the now hushed space. "A year ago, a chance encounter between two artists, one established, one emerging, captured the public's imagination. But what might have remained a heartwarming viral moment has instead transformed into something far more significant, a body of work that stands on its own remarkable merits." She gestured toward Emily, who stepped forward with a composure that still sometimes surprised. "Harusha, thank you all for being here," Emily said, surveying the gathered faces. "This exhibition represents not just my journey, but the countless moments of human connection that made survival possible. Art has always been my voice, but during the darkest days of illness, it became something more. A lifeline, a purpose, a way to transform pain into meaning." Her gaze found her parents in the crowd, her father's eyes suspiciously bright with unshed tears, her mother's smile trembling with pride. Beyond my personal story lies a larger truth, that art matters, not as luxury or decoration, but as essential testimony to the human experience. Every artist in this room understands that compulsion to create, to speak truth through image or form, and every person who values art participates in an ancient conversation about what it means to be alive, to suffer, to hope, to connect. Emily paused, finding Meryl among the guests. Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding. "Tonight I'm honored to unveil the final piece of this collection, a portrait commissioned for the private collection of someone who taught me that recognition is the most profound gift we can offer another person. Not fame, not viral attention, but the simple act of truly seeing." At her nod, gallery assistants gently removed the draping, revealing the portrait of Meryl. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd as they absorbed the unconventional approach, not Meryl as cultural icon or celebrated actress, but Meryl as witness, her gaze reflecting the hospital window painting that had started everything. Emily watched as Meryl approached the canvas, studying it with the same intensity she brought to every aspect of her craft. When she turned toward Emily, her eyes held both surprise and profound appreciation. "You captured not my face, but my seeing," Meryl said quietly when they stood together before the portrait. "No one has ever done that before." "It's what you gave me," Emily replied, "the gift of being truly seen." The formal portion of the evening continued with the gallery director announcing that a percentage of all sales would benefit the Emily Wells Art Foundation, which had expanded its mission to provide both financial support and exhibition opportunities for artists facing serious illness. In its first year, the foundation has supported 27 artists across multiple disciplines, the director explained. "Tonight I'm pleased to announce that through the extraordinary generosity of several donors, including Mrs. Streep, the foundation will now be able to provide health insurance grants to qualifying artists." Applause rippled through the gallery. Emily, standing beside the foundation's board members, felt the weight of what they had accomplished. What had begun as her personal struggle had expanded into something that would outlast her individual experience, a structure for ongoing support, a recognition that art and artists deserved protection. Later, as guests circulated through the exhibition, Emily found herself approached by a young woman clutching a sketchbook. "I started Chemo last month," the woman said hesitantly. "Your story, it gave me permission to keep creating even when everything else feels out of control." Emily embraced her gently. "What's your name?" "Sophia." "Show me your work, Sophia." As they sat on a bench in the quiet corner of the gallery, Emily looking through Sophia's sketches with genuine interest, she realized the circle was completing itself. She was becoming for this young artist what Meryl had been for her, not a savior, not a solution, but a witness, someone who stopped to truly see. Across the room, Meryl engaged in conversation with Emily's oncologist, Dr. Patel, both of them gesturing toward a painting that depicted the moment Emily had received news of her remission, not through medical imagery, but through a metaphorical landscape where shadows receded before advancing light. The exhibition would travel to 3 other cities after New York. The foundation would continue growing. Emily's next series, already taking shape in her studio, would move beyond her personal narrative to explore broader themes of human resilience. But on this night, standing in the gallery surrounded by the visual testimony of her journey, Emily understood that the true legacy of that chance encounter in Washington Square Park wasn't fame or financial security, or even artistic recognition. It was the reminder that human connection, the willingness to stop, to see, to value another person's truth, could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. As the evening drew to a close, Emily found herself standing beside Meryl near the gallery entrance. "What comes next for you?" Meryl asked. Emily smiled. "More painting, more living, more seeing. The best possible legacy," Meryl replied. Outside, beyond the gallery's elegant facade, New York continued its perpetual motion. Somewhere in the city, another artist was creating in obscurity. Another patient was receiving life-altering news. Another human was seeking connection through their work. The story that had begun with Emily and Meryl would repeat itself in countless variations. Different characters, different circumstances, but the same essential truth. That art could bridge impossible divides. That seeing could be an act of profound courage. That transformation was always possible, even in the darkest circumstances. Emily's legacy would be not just in the paintings that bore her signature or the foundation that carried her name, but in this understanding that had guided her from the beginning, that the most valuable thing we can offer another person is the gift of being truly seen.